Welcome to Asian Times TV, the cutting-edge show from Princeton that looks at U.S. and Asia in depth. We're concerned about what's called the America's Pacific Century, or the pivot that the United States is making, as enunciated by the State Department, by Hillary Clinton. President Obama have talked about this extensively in recent speeches, that the United States is moving out of the Middle East, at least for now, and focus in a concerted way on the Asia-Pacific region, and it's called America's Pacific Pivot. So we have with us today a very special guest. Professor Uwe Gielen has studied sociology and psychology at Free University in Berlin, Germany, and subsequently received a master's in psychology from Wake Forest in North Carolina, and he also holds a PhD in social psychology from Harvard, where he completed his dissertation on moral reasoning of radical German students under the guidance of Lawrence Kohlberg, the moral theorist. Currently, he's a professor of psychology and is executive director of the Institute for International and Cross-Cultural Psychology, where, incidentally, I'm also a senior fellow. This is a center that he founded at St. Francis College in Brooklyn Heights, New York, and has been heading it since 1998. He's also taught at Shanghai Normal University in China, so we're going to talk to him about China, and at Padua University in Italy, northern Italy, at Montfort College in India, Fordham University in New York, and has lectured at 32 different colleges and universities around the world. In addition, he has served as president of the International Council of Psychologists and the Society for Cross-Cultural Research, and the APA's international division, which is Division 52, focused primarily with international psychology, or the globalization of psychology, as we call it. So his area of main interest, which really concerns our show in some ways, is really the relevance of psychology as we globalize, and as American presence is increasingly felt around the world. So we're going to start off by asking him, what does he think about this recent pivot, America's Pacific Pivot, or America's Pacific Century as it's called now? Professor Gielen, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here. I think the shift toward the Pacific and Asia is unavoidable. Asia has, a good 60% of the population of the world, and it has several very large countries, China, India, and so on, that over the centuries have played an essential role in world history, and it's bound to happen that they will be front and center stage in the coming decades. That's at least my opinion. And so I've been interested for quite a few decades now. I've been in China, India, Taiwan, Japan, and some other Asian countries, as well as in the Middle East. And I'm sort of looking forward to a world that will be somewhat more globally oriented and somewhat less Western-centered than it has been in the 20th century, when the West, until fairly recently, dominated the world stage.
So where would you mark the turning point, if kind of in recent history, if you were to go back a few years, where would you mark this turning point that the shift began to take place, you think?
I think there is not one fixed turning point, but there's sort of like an ongoing series. First of all, India becoming independent. It took India a few decades to sort of become what it used to be in some sense. China becoming at first an Asian power in the 60s and 70s, and in the last few decades, especially because of economic reasons, also more and more a world power. Japan, of course, the first non-Western country of any major import to industrialize as early as 120, 110 years ago, was also sort of a forerunner of these developments.
So you would say this is kind of a cascading kind of an event that's been occurring now for at least, approximately, you could say, if you go back to Japan, for the last 50 years or so, after the war then?
Certainly after World War II, Europe was, of course, much weakened because of the war events. The United States became dominant in a unique sense, but that dominance cannot stay or remain forever. It is actually somewhat abnormal that about 4% of the world's population, which is what the population of the United States is, should have such a huge influence on the world stage.
Right, because when we look at the Eurozone, it's about 300 million, 350 million people, which is the population of the United States, which is roughly constitutes, in terms of numbers, the middle class in a country like India, and of course even larger in China now.
That's right. The Chinese population, that's called middle class, 300, 350 million, depending on where you draw the line. And of course, even more importantly, the number and the percentage of China's population that is middle class is increasing steadily and at a rather rapid pace. So what's 300 million now may well be 400 and ultimately 500 million in 10 or 20 years. And that is already more than either the US will be in 20 years or the Eurozone.
So then how does this become, conceptually, how do you frame this America-specific century, at least theoretically, at the start of the 21st century? How is this, conceptually possible, do you think, that America would potentially be dominant still in the 21st century?
I think many people have said, and I agree with this, that we are going to be living in a world in a few decades that doesn't have one single dominant power. At present, while the US is still the dominant military power, even though China is coming up, it is not quite as much the dominant economic power, in part because the US is heavily indebted, and even though it still has easily the largest gross national product, countries like China are increasing their gross national product at a higher rate over the last 2 or 3 decades than either Europe or the United States. So I see China coming up first in economic terms, and then inevitably also in military terms in the next 20, 30 years or so.
Yeah, now when I pose this question to kind of international relations experts, I get different answers. Some, reply that yes, this has been long time in the making. In fact, the United States has initiated this cooperative move or a rapprochement with the Pacific, where U.S. has been a dominant power since World War II, right? Because of the Pearl Harbor and that whole history in the Pacific. Because generally when we think of World War II and America coming into dominance, we think of the Atlantic powers. We think less of the Pacific powers, but that's also a significant theater that the United States has played in. And so the answer that I get is, well, this is something that we've wanted to do for many, many years, and that U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy really opened China, and now China has come into its own. And so it's time for America to further develop these relationships in a concerted, way, in a cooperative way, and that this is something that the United States has wanted for, since the, end of the Cold War, and even earlier, perhaps. How would you address that?
I don't totally agree with this, because if we think of China as the dominant Pacific power outside the US right now, we have to remember it's a communist country. And the United States and communism have always had problems with each other, so to speak. Right? So I don't think the United States wanted China as a communist country to rise as much as it has, at least economically, risen in recent decades. And it's throwing its way around now in Latin America even, certainly in Africa, and also in Europe. And I don't think this is quite what the U.S. had in mind.
Okay, interesting. So what is China's involvement in Europe, and how do you explain kind of the current crisis in the Eurozone? I was just there actually in Germany recently, your native country, in northern Germany, and celebrating a 70th birthday really of a dear friend of ours. And a couple of impressions that really stood out for me. One impression was very distinctly that I was looking at an aging population. Like if you go to Asia, India or China, or, elsewhere, you see streets sort of teeming with young kids. In northern Germany, you get a very distinct sense of an affluence that's been there for many, many years, and a kind of leisurely lifestyle. Clearly people are very hardworking and productive, but because of the demographic shift, it's a senior population for the most part, 50 plus, that you see and that you come in contact with, and also so the demographic shift in terms of not seeing kind of the younger demographic groups as actively involved or out in public places. Of course, this is all, I'm talking about public kind of places, and in sociological terms, kind of public impressions, if you will, of what life is like. But is that because you go there often and frequently? So is that also your understanding of what's going on in the Eurozone?
Democratic developments are certainly one essential part of what is going on in a country. Basically, all European countries have birth rates that are somewhere between 1.2 and 1.8. If we, for a moment, forget about Albania, the United States has a birth rate of about 2.1 per woman per lifetime. China has also an aging population, even though the number that the population is going to reach is probably about 1.5 or so in 2050. But then, supposedly, if the demographers are correct, it will level out. So India has the youngest population of these big powers. China is sort of in between. Then comes the US and Europe, and incidentally also Japan have very low birth rates, and of course Eastern Europe even lower. And there wouldn't be all that migration into the European countries without these countries basically not replacing their populations through birth. That's a fundamental trend in Europe. And also in East Asia, by which at the moment I mean Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and to some degree even China.
So, but in terms of the crisis in Eurozone, and of course the German experience in the Eurozone as kind of the arbiter of the country or the nation that's really holding it together in the current sort of crisis. Speak about that a little bit, because I know you go to Germany regularly and you study there. What is your sort of historical perspective on what's going on?
Well, I'm interested in cultural differences, and I grew up in Germany, and there used to be jokes around. So people would say, the Germans live so that they can work, and the Italians work so that they can live. So clearly a somewhat different set of priorities. And what you see now in the Eurozone, at least in my opinion, is at least in part due to cultural differences that are quite long-standing.
I see.
In other words, except for Ireland, it's the Mediterranean countries that are in trouble. Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal. You know what the Germans somewhat facetiously call the Club Mediterranean.
Right.
So the
Right.
people who want to retire at age 50 or 55.
Right, and that's what one of the reporters from Financial Times that I just listened to coming in on the radio was talking about how one way to salvage Greece and all these Mediterranean European countries is to have all the Germans go there for holidays. That would certainly boost up the economy.
I mean, tourism in Greece is a key industry. In Spain, it is also very important as it is in Italy, but that's not enough. I mean, one problem that Greece has.
No, but we're just kind of joking around, but but this is in fact the kind of the humor that people have about it partly. Although I've also heard Germans say, when I was there, that this crisis is really nothing compared to what the Germans have gone through in terms of national identity development or national development, for the last 50, 60, 70 years. This is something that will pass. Certainly that's one view. And that will certainly be patched over. But it's a serious crisis, in terms of financial and banking systems, with heavy debt, no revenue coming in, not having a productive population, relying on migratory labor, either from Turkey or North Africa or what have you, and it really puts Europe potentially in a logjam in terms of being able to meet what you may call the P&L, the profit and loss kind of equation on their balance sheets.
From a German point of view, of course, the present crisis cannot compare to, certainly not to World War I and II, and then the division of the country into East and West Germany, then the reunification, which involved huge sums of money ultimately. So compared to this, the present crisis, at least for Germany, not necessarily for other European countries, is not an essential crisis. It's not a crisis quite the way that wars are. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's really a crisis that involves a huge chunk of Europe. And in my opinion, Europe will take years to get out of this. Even if they're as skillful as possible, and if they ultimately get out of this crisis, it will take years. And during those years, the countries will either stagnate, economically speaking, or even go backwards, like Greece certainly is, and Portugal to a lesser degree. And what will happen in Spain and perhaps Italy, that is everybody's guess still.
Mm-hmm. So now moving on to your current project, which is kind of in a way related to China, because earlier we were talking about China and how China is dominant and rising. You've been studying the immigrant population in New York City, the Chinese immigrant population in Chinatown. So speak about that project now, if you will.
Yes, it is a project that involves several of us. Besides myself, there is Professor Lei Ting, who grew up in Taiwan, National Taiwan University, graduate, and then came to the U.S., went to Harvard in human development, where I met him. And Jonathan Palumbo, who was the 2010 valedictorian at St. Francis College, where I am teaching, and Zhenmu Jing, who comes originally from Shanghai and is now a graduate student at Shanghai. So there are several of us involved in this project. It's a project that consists really of several sub-projects, so I will talk only about one, which is an essay competition for Chinese American students who grew up during at least part of their childhood in New York City. And this was a competition for anybody Chinese American who wanted to participate. We received 82 autobiographical essays. 49 of those were by high school students, and the rest basically by college students from all sorts of institutions in all boroughs of New York City. And each student wrote either in English, about 3/4, or in Chinese, about 1/4 of the essays, about her or his sort of life experience as a Chinese American in New York City. Mm-hmm. That is the project. And we're now editing these essays, at least a selection of them, 28. And we're pretty close to finishing up the book that will include the 28 essays, as well as sort of introductions, concluding remarks, trying to frame these essays in a broader context, what it means to be a Chinese American adolescent or emerging young adult in this city of New York.
Right. So what is the project called? Or what is the book called that's going to be coming out of this? Is it something about dragon seed or something, I think you said?
No, we changed the topic. It's now called From Adversity to Achievement, Growing Up Chinese in New York City.
Okay.
Originally, we had called it Dragon Seed, but that will be our follow-up book. We're going to do a second one that's based on long interviews. So the first book, we're almost finished with the manuscript, and I'm looking forward to giving it to a publisher so they can take a look at it.
So did you find a lot of tiger moms in your sample, or references to a lot of tiger moms?
It's a little bit complicated to answer. Let me first, for a moment, discuss a couple important differences between Amy Chua, the tiger mom,
sure,
Yale University professor, and the parents of the students who sent us their life experiences.
Right.
Most of our students come from a working class or lower middle class background. So they are not professors at Yale University. And which means that since both the father, not a Chinese, and the mother are PhDs and Yale University professors, that's very much an elite from an educational point of view. And that doesn't describe the parents in our sample at all. In fact, quite a few of these parents come, let's say, from Fujian province, and haven't, in quite a few cases, even finished high school, never mind college, or even less so graduate school.
So Amy Chua is more part of the kind of the Chinese diaspora, or the elite Chinese diaspora, right?
She is a member of the elite.
Yeah.
And there are, of course, many members of the elite. If you go to Silicon Valley, where there are lots of Asian entrepreneurs, of course,
right,
it's a very different group than most immigrants from either China or Singapore, Taiwan, here in New York City, who are much more likely to be working class, or in fact, sometimes they live well below the poverty line. But in spite of this, it is still striking how many of our students are educationally successful. We get many contributions from Stuyvesant High School, perhaps the most famous sort of public high school where you can enter only by doing exceedingly well on an entrance examination. And yet, about 43% of the Chinese students at Stuyvesant High School get lunch money. In other words, their family is dirt poor. That is impressive.
So they're very achievement motivated, and you think socialization, obviously, this is what you're bringing out in the book, the kind of specific Chinese type of socialization that you see in New York brings these kids up to achieve, to go from adversity to high level of achievement.
certainly the ones who are likely to write essays. So if you have a high school dropout, and of course there are some Chinese high school or college dropouts, they're not the ones who are going to send us autobiographical essays. So our group is a bit selective. But nevertheless, it is a very achievement-oriented group. And even if the mothers are not exactly tiger mothers, there is no doubt that in the Chinese American community, there is enormous pressure on these children, and the majority of our writers are actually females, to achieve. Mm-hmm. And every Chinese American knows this. If it's not true in their own family, they actually will mention this in their essays or their interviews. They will say, yeah, you know, my parents aren't quite that Asian, which means there's pressure on education. But certainly among my best friends, you know, that's more the exception than the rule, not to be that Asian as a parent. So I wouldn't call them tiger mothers, but I would call them certainly placing heavy emphasis on the children doing well. And the children, this is very important, understand this. They know that many of these parents make great sacrifices to come to the United States. Some were smuggled in and had to pay enormous fees to these snakeheads, these smugglers. And the parents come here not for themselves so much. They come here because they believe their children will have better educational and economic chances. And the children typically understand this. And they feel bound by these self-sacrificing parents.
Yeah, fantastic. So we look forward to that, you know, the book project, which will be finishing up soon. I think you said we have pictures, of course, which we will be showing during this program from that project. So do you believe, as some scholars and sociologists are arguing, that clearly the input from the Chinese, or broadly, let's say, the Asian American community, might account for what you might call some sort of an Asian American you know, century, kind of going back to the idea of this Pacific century, that at home itself, that the resurgence of the new immigrants, if you will, into New York, right, which have had traditional sort of immigrant groups come in to New York, right? The classic works by Moynihan and others talks about the migration into New York. So do you feel like there's this new immigrant population in some ways creating a new culture of achievement and success that's changing American society?
Let me first tell a little story. I was once at a conference at the Chinese University in Hong Kong, and the conference under the leadership of Michael Bond, a Canadian professor at Chinese University, one of the leading experts on Chinese socialization, had called this conference together. And there was, you know, in the evening at dinner, people were arguing what the new century will be like. And one person said, well, you know, the Chinese are going to beat the Americans. The Americans are, you know, a little bit fat and relaxing now. And another Chinese said, no, no, no. You know what's going to happen is that the Chinese in the United States, our Chinese, are going to beat the other Chinese back in China. They're so achievement-oriented here in the U.S.
Unfortunately, we are, on that note, we're out of time. So thank you for joining us, and thank you, our viewers, for tuning into this very fascinating discussion from the perspective of international psychology or global psychology on not only the Eurozone and the rise of China, but also how the immigration and the ethnic composition of the United States itself is potentially making America more innovative, creative, and at the cutting edge of a lot of these global changes that are taking place, not only outside our borders, but within our borders as well. So thank you for joining us, and tune in again to Asian Times TV.